Welcome to Philly Coco Presents Side Project Spotlight, episode 33. This is developers' journey to making cool stuff. I'm Kotaro, and I help run Philly Coco. Philly Coco is a Philadelphia-based Cocoa Heads community focused on Apple development that primarily, but not exclusively, means iOS, Mac, tvOS, and watchOS development. Philly Coco's true desire is to take you higher on your own developer journey. Well, Happy New Year's, everyone. We are into the year 2023, and it's the year of the rabbit, so yay. Cool. So, some podcast updates. As you noticed, Steve and Aaron are not with us today because they are, Steve particularly is recovering from some little issue with his sore throat. Hopefully we will get back into the swing of things again, probably within 2 weeks. So look forward to that. So you can probably think of this as a very short podcast today, another solo cast, if you will. Won't be anything too long. Having said all that, the other thing that I would like to provide a update is our to-do list app, PickleJar, or as we try to call it, a habit-forming app. For people who have not heard this podcast, Side Project Spotlight, the podcast, was designed to sort of it's like an accountability podcast. We're trying to get back into swing of things, of building things. That's one of the foundational things that made Philly Cocoa Heads community really great, is that everybody would come together and they all had their own little side projects, their own little projects that they were working on that they were excited about. And I want to get back into that. I think that was one of the cool things that made Philly Coco great, is that we had a lot of people who had a lot of different ideas and didn't have to fall in the context of like iOS. It could have been the web, it could have been games, it could have been social media apps. There was just a wide range of interesting ideas that people would come to Philly Coco and present. So one of the things that we tried to do was build like these small little side projects that we all had some interest in. One of the things that Steve and Aaron and myself had sort of agreed upon when we started this particular project was to figure out how to make Mac apps. I think that was my personal goal, was to get good at making Mac apps, because I've never built one from the ground up for as long as I've been developing apps in the Apple ecosystem. The Mac app has been sort of the faraway goal, and with SwiftUI maturing to a point where building Mac apps is actually kind of this interesting space, kind of untouched. Usually a lot of AppKit developers would kind of like shun it as like a sort of like, oh, it's like a baby app, or it's like a baby Mac app. It's not as full featured and not as fleshed out, and you can't do as many complex, interesting things in that space. And I 100% agree with that. But, for somebody who's just starting and who's much more familiar in the flow of SwiftUI now, I think it's a fascinating space to sort of explore, well, can I now do this cross-platform app? So I think what's easier than a to-do list app in many ways to start off with. So we start out with that idea in mind. But the thing about making a Mac app, the vision was to start when WWDC finished up and we sort of understood what was coming ahead. We wanted to get a to-do list style app out by September, October. Which is the release of the new iOS 16 and all the other related systems updates. But what we quickly found out was trying to build a Mac app on a beta version, you needed the beta version of the Mac OS Ventura installed. And we all had our own gripes about trying to pull that off. I think we had thought, this was a sort of a tricky proposition for all three of us. I didn't have a machine that I can willfully install Mac Ventura on a beta version of Mac Ventura on willy-nilly. And while I have done partitions in the past, I didn't have the desire to do something like that so I think we quickly pivoted over to just focusing on iOS. So iPhone and iPad, start with those systems first, and then do macOS once that was fully released as a production app, a production product. And then the challenge was, how do we make it, this to-do list app would be something that we would want to use versus like, oh, it's just a glorified portfolio app. So we got into visiting the space of to-do lists, and we thought maybe this could be something that we could focus on much more in the habit-forming space. So our goal was to find ways to quickly enter in, did I do this to do, let's say, like 25 push-ups a day? That was the goal. So if I did the 25 push-ups, I would say, yes, I did it. And then it would be a lot easier to sort of visually see that progress on an iPad. So maybe the kind of idea was like, do the functional like day-to-day, like, yes, I did it, no, I didn't do this task on an iPhone, and then let the iPad be expressed much more like a way to visualize that data, maybe even take advantage of the new SwiftUI charts framework. We started in sort of like very in steps and sort of in sprints of like, okay, here's what this UI would look like on the iPhone, and then translate it to the iPad using Sketch. And, that can be a long, laborious task in its own right, because you're trying to, it's almost like its own big project. It turned into a bigger project than I think we all had sort of anticipated. So I think now with the new year and some decent amount of rest, we can reset, and going forward, we'll figure out a game plan. So look forward to that in the next podcast of how we do that. One thing I also wanted to mention was kind of explore this idea about, speaking of goals, talk about my personal developer goals for this new year. I think that that's a sort of thing where I know people get a little caught up in like, oh, if I reveal my, New Year's resolution, like somehow that won't happen. It's like, well, the opposite can be true of saying, if I don't put it out there in the world, I won't feel forced to actually commit to the concept. So I'm going to put that out there. And I almost think of it much closer like it's not really a particularly hard thing to put out there, because it's much more like a process I'm trying to sort of explore more so than an end goal. So, for example, like my first resolution or goal for this year is to get a better understanding of a full workflow of how to develop a Mac app and then build and deploy a Mac app. And ultimately, not so much deploy it on the App Store or anything like that, just get a usable product that can use every day. That's very relatively attainable goal, I think. Second goal is to improve my skill with shaders. Shaders are this kind of nebulous, interesting space in development world where it can be very applicable in a lot of ways to different types of UIs. And mostly it's known in the space of the gaming space, which I do as my own other side project, is that I like to make, small little mini games. But it's also applicable to building 3D spaces for which then I can superimpose some either post-processing or even effects on 3D objects. So I want to get good at that. I think that has a lot of cross-platform appeal to me. And speaking of cross-platform, I also want to get good at another game engine this year. I think that Unity is a great product, Unity is a game engine that's most popular with mobile games or indie games. So if you're starting out with making games and you need sort of like a very popular and very well-used engine, the Unity engine is probably the best starting point if you're trying to make with a lack of a better word, a more mainstream indie game that has the potential to be cross-platform in all the platforms, most of the platforms. But it's such a mature but also very brittle type of engine, so that you can get lost in a lot of weeds and a lot of different branches of this particular part of the tech versus and they're not always baked in very well, so or well thought out, and they always change. So I wanted to try something a little more evergreen, and I think the Godot engine, which is an open source game engine, provides that opportunity, and there's been a lot of progress made with that engine and a lot of momentum with that one. So I think that the Godot engine, spelled robot, but instead of an R, it's a G, had reminded me a lot of Unity in its early days when it was just a Mac developer platform. So I kind of like that spirit of it. And since I only tend to focus on 2D games, it really does lend itself very well to a 2D game environment. So that's something I want to get good at this year. But having said all that, that's all I have for today. You can learn more about Philly Cocoa at phillycocoa.org. There you'll find links to our podcast episodes, Slack group, meetup schedule, and contact info. If you're feeling generous, please leave a rating and review on Apple, Spotify, or whichever podcast platform of choice you enjoy. Also, and share us with all your developer friends. And one more thing, I decided to ask ChatGPT to give me a programmer joke about Swift, and the response was, why was the Swift developer sad? Because his code didn't have any type. Obviously not great, so I asked him to give me a better one. Why did Swift developer go to the doctor? Because his code had too many bugs. Wow. Alright, one more. Why was the Swift developer so good at math? Because he was always casting to ints. I'm not sure if that was considered even a joke, but it's safe to say that comedians' jobs, at least in this version of ChatGPT, are totally safe. Till next time, good luck on your own developer journey. We will cheer for you always.